They thought it's just an ant nest, but what a mountain man discovered beneath left everyone in shock. Out in the high country, a quiet loner strikes his spade into the dirt, only for the ground to collapse beneath his feet. In the flicker of lamplight, he finds weapons, coins, and papers so old they could change the fate of the valley forever. At first, the town laughs it off. But when an outcast widow steps forward, claiming the papers prove she owns every ranch, every river, and every acre of land, everything turns deadly serious. Dust rises in the streets as ranchers gather. The church bell tolls, the banker whispers lies, and jail keys rattle in the dark. The mountain man must decide, stand with the widow or watch the valley fall into ruin. But what else lies hidden beneath those burned caverns? Who truly has the right to the springs that mean life or death? And when the final judgment falls, will mercy win, or will greed burn the valley to ashes? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Oliver Boone's modest yard as he worked to mend the sagging fence line. His weathered hands gripped the wooden post, testing its stability with practiced movements. The spring thaw had loosened several sections, and he couldn't afford to let his few head of cattle wander off into the vast wilderness beyond. Wiping sweat from his brow, Oliver paused to survey his work. That's when he noticed the strange red mound snaking across his yard. The setting sun painted the disturbed earth an even deeper crimson, making the line of ants appear like a wound across the rough ground. "Dadgum varmints," he muttered, his voice rough from disuse. Living alone meant he rarely had cause to speak above a whisper, and the sound of his own voice sometimes startled him these days. Oliver trudged to his tool shed, the leather of his boots creaking with each step. The spade's wooden handle felt smooth and familiar in his calloused grip as he returned to deal with the ant problem. No sense letting them get established. They'd only cause trouble come summer. The first strike of the spade hit something harder than expected. Oliver frowned, adjusting his stance to dig deeper. The second blow sent vibrations up his arms as the ground suddenly gave way beneath the blade. A section of earth no bigger than a wagon wheel collapsed inward, revealing a dark void below. "What in tarnation?" Oliver muttered, stepping back cautiously. He'd heard tales of old mine shafts and Indian burial grounds, but nothing about caves or tunnels on his modest plot of land. Dusk was settling fast now, painting the mountains purple against the darkening sky. Oliver hurried to his cabin and returned with his trusted brass lantern, its flame flickering as he carefully approached the mysterious opening. Kneeling at the edge, he held the light out over the void. The lantern's glow revealed a small cavern, maybe 6 feet deep and twice as wide. The walls were roughly hewn, suggesting human hands had carved this space. But what caught Oliver's eye made his breath catch: the glint of metal beneath years of dirt and debris. Using the spade as an anchor, Oliver carefully lowered himself into the hollow. The air was stale and thick with the mustiness of long-buried secrets. His boots crunched on loose soil as he crouched to examine his discovery. Several rusty muskets lay stacked against one wall, their wooden stocks rotted and metal parts corroded beyond salvage. Scattered nearby, he found what looked like old coins, Spanish pieces of 8, their once bright silver now dark with tarnish. But it was the oilskin bundle wedged in the corner that drew his attention most keenly. The package was about the size of his mother's old family Bible, wrapped carefully in layers of treated leather that had protected its contents from decades of moisture. Oliver gathered it carefully, along with a handful of the coins, and pulled himself back to the surface. The cry of coyotes echoed from the distant hills as he made his way to his cabin. The night air had grown bitter cold, making his joints ache as he climbed the rough-hewn steps to his door. Inside, he added wood to the dying fire and settled at his crude table, positioning his lantern just so. With careful fingers, Oliver began unwrapping the oilskin bundle. The leather was stiff but intact, testament to whoever had taken such care to preserve what lay within. As the final layer fell away, he found himself staring at a stack of documents, their parchment yellow with age but remarkably preserved. The firelight danced across strange seals pressed into red wax, official-looking marks that meant nothing to Oliver. The text was written in flowing script, but the words were Spanish, a language he'd never learned despite his years in territory once claimed by Mexico. Oliver's fingers trembled slightly as he spread the documents across his table. Though he couldn't read them, he recognized their importance. Land grants had been a source of bitter dispute ever since the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, with Mexican families fighting to prove their claims against new American settlers. He'd heard stories of ancient Spanish land grants worth thousands of acres, their rightful owners dispossessed by those who could afford better lawyers or faster guns. The coyote's cries grew closer as Oliver studied the papers in the lamplight. He could make out dates, 1700 and something, and what looked like names. Maps had been carefully drawn in the margins, showing boundary marks he thought he recognized from his own wanderings through these mountains. A gust of wind rattled his cabin's window, making the lantern flame dance. Oliver carefully gathered the papers, his mind churning with questions. Who had hidden these documents? What lands did they describe? And most importantly, what was he supposed to do with them now? He'd lived alone in these mountains for nigh on 15 years, ever since losing his family to fever. He'd chosen solitude, finding peace in the simplicity of his days, checking his trap lines, tending his small herd, trading in town only when necessary. But these papers represented something larger than himself, a responsibility he wasn't sure he wanted but couldn't rightly ignore. Oliver wrapped the documents carefully in the oilskin, securing them as he'd found them. The Spanish coins he placed in a leather pouch, tucking both items into the old chest where he kept his few valuables, his wife's wedding ring, the family Bible, and the journal where he sometimes wrote his thoughts on lonely evenings. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the pine trees that surrounded his cabin. Oliver added another log to the fire, his movements deliberate as he considered his next steps. Come morning, he'd need to decide what to do with his discovery. For now, though, he sat in his favorite chair, watching the flames dance and listening to the night sounds of the mountain, knowing sleep would be long in coming. The weight of the discovery settled over him like a heavy blanket. In all his years of solitude, he'd grown comfortable with the simplicity of his life, the predictable rhythm of seasons and survival. But now, fate had dropped something in his lap that threatened to upset that careful balance. These weren't just old papers to be ignored or sold for profit. They were somebody's history, somebody's rightful claim to the very land he called home. As the fire crackled and popped, Oliver's thoughts turned to the responsibility now resting in his chest. Someone had gone to great lengths to preserve these documents, hiding them away where they'd remained safe for who knew how many years. Now they'd been found, and by his hand. What that meant, he wasn't yet sure, but he knew it would require him to step out of the comfortable isolation he'd built around himself. The night grew deeper, and still Oliver sat, his weathered face illuminated by the dying fire, while outside his cabin, the wind whispered secrets of its own through the ancient pines. The morning sun painted long shadows across Oliver's yard as he saddled his bay mare. He'd barely slept, his mind churning with questions about the mysterious documents now carefully rolled in oilskin and tucked into his saddlebag. The mare shifted restlessly, sensing his unease as he tightened the cinch. "Easy there, girl," he murmured, patting her neck. "Just a quick ride into town." The trail to Willow Flats wound through stands of aspen and pine, their leaves shimmering gold in the early light. Oliver rarely made the 2-hour journey unless necessity demanded it, preferring the quiet of his mountain solitude to the bustle of town. But these papers required knowledge beyond his own. By mid-morning, the wooden buildings of Willow Flats came into view, smoke rising from chimneys against the mountain backdrop. Oliver guided his horse down the rutted main street, past the telegraph office and the blacksmith shop. The familiar creak of his saddle drew curious glances from townsfolk who weren't used to seeing the reclusive mountain man in their midst. He dismounted in front of Hendrick's general store, securing his mare to the hitching post. The wooden steps groaned under his boots as he climbed to the porch, nodding briefly to Mrs. Peterson and her young daughter, who were examining bolts of calico in the window. The store's bell jingled as Oliver stepped inside. Tom Hendricks looked up from his ledger, surprise flickering across his face. "Oliver Boone? Ain't seen you since spring trading. What brings you down the mountain?" Oliver removed his hat, running a hand through his graying hair. "Need someone who can read Spanish, Tom. Found some old papers that need looking at." Before Hendricks could respond, the door chimed again. Oliver turned to see Taza, the elderly Apache who sometimes traded herbs and blankets in town, standing in the doorway. The old man's dark eyes were keen, despite his advanced years, taking in the scene before him. "Spanish papers?" Taza asked, his voice carrying the weight of years. "Many such documents passed through these lands in the old days." Oliver studied the elder for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Reckon you might know something about them." Taza gestured to the boarding house porch across the street. "Better light there. Show me what you have found." The two men settled into the worn chairs on the boarding house porch, where the morning sun provided clear light. Oliver carefully unrolled the oilskin bundle, spreading the documents on a small table between them. Taza leaned forward, his weathered fingers hovering over the red wax seals. "These are the marks of Spanish authority," Taza said, his voice low but certain. "I have seen their like before, when I was young." The Spanish officials would come with their papers and their priests, marking boundaries and making promises to the people. A few townspeople had gathered at the edge of the porch, drawn by the unusual sight of the mountain man and Apache elder bent over mysterious documents. Oliver noticed Tom Hendricks had followed them out of his store, standing now at the bottom of the steps with undisguised interest. "Can you read what they say?" Oliver asked. Taza shook his head. "The words, number. But these marks tell their own story. See here?" His finger traced the elaborate seal. "This was pressed by a man of power, one who spoke for the Spanish crown. These papers speak of land, who owns it, where the boundaries lie." The crowd grew larger as word spread through town. Oliver shifted uncomfortably as more faces appeared, ranch hands taking their noon break, women pausing in their shopping, children craning their necks to see what was going on, next to see what the commotion was about. The saloon doors across the street swung open, and banker Silas Rourke emerged, his pressed suit stark against the dusty street. He made his way toward the boarding house, followed closely by James Morton, the railroad company's surveyor. "What's all this about Spanish papers?" Rourke asked, his tone carefully pleasant, though his eyes were sharp with interest. Oliver straightened in his chair, instinctively guarded. "Found them buried under my property up on the mountain, just trying to figure out what they mean." Rourke adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles, peering at the documents. "Most interesting. You know, Mr. Boone, if you're looking to sell." "Ain't looking to sell anything," Oliver cut in firmly. "Just want to know what they say." The banker's smile tightened slightly. "Of course. But you should know that old Spanish land grants can be quite valuable to the right parties, the railroad, for instance." "These papers carry weight," Taza interrupted, his voice carrying unexpected authority. "They speak of boundaries set long ago, promises made between peoples. Such things should not be traded like cattle or corn." The crowd had grown to nearly 30 people now, their murmured conversations creating a constant undercurrent of speculation. Oliver heard fragments of whispered discussions: Spanish gold, hidden treasures, land rights, and felt the weight of dozens of curious stares. Morton, the railroad surveyor, pushed forward. "Let me see those seals again." He reached for the documents, but Oliver carefully rolled them back into the oilskin. "Think I'll wait to show these to someone who can proper read them," he said, rising from his chair. The sun was well past its peak now, and he'd had more than enough of being the center of attention. "I know a fellow in Santa Fe," Rourke offered quickly. "I'd be happy to take them there myself." "Much obliged," Oliver cut in, "but I'll see to it myself." He nodded his thanks to Taza, who acknowledged him with a slight inclination of his head. The crowd parted as Oliver made his way to the saloon, where he'd planned to get supper before the long ride home. He could feel their eyes following him, could sense the ripple of excitement his discovery had caused in the small town. Inside the saloon, Oliver found a quiet corner table and ordered a simple meal of beef stew and coffee. The usual evening crowd was filtering in, but tonight their conversations all seemed to center on one topic: the mountain man's mysterious Spanish papers. He ate quickly, keeping the oilskin bundle close. The documents that had seemed simply curious last night now felt like a heavier responsibility. Taza's words about promises and boundaries echoed in his mind, along with the gleam of interest he'd seen in Banker Rourke's eyes. The sun was setting by the time Oliver stepped back onto the street, painting the dusty town in shades of gold and purple. The crowd had dispersed, but he could feel the lingering awareness of his presence, could see curtains twitching in windows as he made his way to where his mare waited patiently. As he mounted up for the ride home, Oliver caught sight of Taza sitting quietly in the growing shadows of the boarding house porch. The old man raised his hand in farewell, a gesture that seemed to carry both warning and blessing. The mare's hooves kicked up small clouds of dust as Oliver guided her toward the mountain trail. Behind him, the town buzzed with the day's excitement, but ahead lay the familiar solitude of his cabin. Yet somehow he knew things would never be quite the same. The papers in his saddlebag had set something in motion, something that would reach far beyond his simple life as a mountain man. The evening breeze carried the scent of sage and pine as Oliver urged his horse toward home, leaving the whispers and speculation of Willow Flats behind. But even in the gathering dusk, he could feel the weight of eyes watching his departure, and knew that his discovery had sparked a fire that wouldn't easily be extinguished. Morning sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. Oliver stood before Judge Abner Crowell's massive oak desk, the Spanish documents spread carefully between them. The judge adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles, leaning forward to examine the aged parchments. "These seals are genuine," Judge Crowell said, his voice gravelly from years of pronouncing verdicts. "Spanish land grants carried the full weight of law in their time, and our treaties honor them still." He traced a weathered finger along the faded script. "But proving ownership isn't simple, Mr. Boone." Oliver shifted his weight, boots creaking on the floorboards. "How so, Your Honor?" "These grants passed through families, generation to generation." The judge straightened in his chair, adjusting his black coat. "Without clear proof of descent from the original grantees, they're just interesting pieces of history." A sharp laugh cut through the quiet courthouse. Banker Silas Rourke stood in the doorway, his pressed suit a stark contrast to Oliver's trail-worn clothes. "Surely you're not taking this seriously, Abner?" The banker strode forward, boots clicking on the wooden floor. "Those Spanish nobles and their Indian allies are long gone. No heirs exist." Oliver bristled at Rourke's tone, but held his peace. The banker moved to stand beside the judge's desk, peering down at the documents with poorly concealed interest. "The law is clear," Judge Crowell replied firmly, "if a legitimate heir can prove their lineage." "And where would such an heir come from?" Rourke interrupted, his smile sharp as a knife. "The tribes scattered decades ago. The Spanish returned to Mexico. This is American soil now." The courthouse door creaked again as James Morton, the railroad surveyor, slipped in quietly. He remained near the wall, but his eyes fixed on the documents with keen attention. "That valley crosses our proposed rail line," Morton said softly, almost to himself. The company has plans. Judge Crowell raised his hand for silence. The law stands, gentlemen. These grants were made in good faith and backed by treaty. If an heir exists and can prove their claim, he looked directly at Oliver. But without such proof, the land follows current territorial statutes. Oliver carefully rolled the parchments back into their oilskin wrapping. The morning light had taken on a harsh quality, and the courthouse felt suddenly too cramped, too formal for a man more at home in the mountains. "Much obliged for your time, Your Honor," he said, touching the brim of his hat. He could feel Rourke's calculating gaze following him as he made his way to the door. The day passed slowly in town, as Oliver attended to necessary supplies and repairs. By late afternoon, dark clouds were gathering over the mountains, promising an evening storm. He mounted his mare and headed for home, the mysterious document secure in his saddlebag. The trail wound through stands of pine and across small meadows still bright with late summer flowers. About 2 miles out of town, movement caught his eye. A figure stood beside the path. A woman in a simple dress, her black hair streaked with silver at the temples. "Mr. Boone." Her voice was soft but clear, her English careful and measured. "I am Nayland. I must speak with you." Oliver reined his horse to a stop, studying the woman's face. He had seen her occasionally in town, usually keeping to herself, trading herbs and blankets like many of the local Apache. "About what, ma'am?" "The Spanish papers." She gestured toward his saddlebag. "I heard the talk in town. I may know something about them." Thunder rumbled in the distance. Oliver glanced at the darkening sky, then back at the woman's earnest face. "Best get under shelter before the storm hits. My cabin's not far." Nalin nodded, and Oliver helped her mount behind him. They rode in silence through the gathering dusk, reaching his cabin just as the first heavy drops began to fall. Later, as evening settled over the mountains, Oliver built a small fire near the cavern's entrance, where he had found the documents. The storm had passed, leaving behind the sharp scent of wet earth and pine. Night insects began their evening chorus as Nalin stood in the shadows, clutching a small leather pouch. "My husband," she said slowly, "was a miner named Thomas Crawford. Before he died 5 winters ago, he told me of his grandmother, who married a Spanish officer's son." She opened the pouch with careful fingers. "He left me these." Oliver watched as she removed several folded papers and a small portrait painted on ivory. The lamplight revealed the face of a proud Spanish woman wearing a high lace collar, her features bearing a subtle resemblance to Nalin's own. "Thomas's grandmother," Nalin explained. "She was daughter to one of the grant holders." Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded the papers. "These tell the story, from Spain to Mexico to here. Through marriage and blood, the land passed to Thomas. And from him," she straightened her shoulders, "to me." The night insects fell silent for a moment, as if sensing the weight of her words. Oliver looked from the portrait to the woman standing before him, seeing strength beneath her quiet demeanor. "The judge said proof was needed," he said carefully. Nalin nodded, producing more papers from her pouch, marriage records, birth documents, carefully preserved through decades. "I have kept these safe, though many said they meant nothing now. But I remembered the old stories, of papers hidden when soldiers came, papers like those you found." Oliver spread the Spanish land grant on a flat rock near the fire, its seals gleaming in the flickering light. Nalin laid her documents beside it, and even to his untrained eye, the connections were clear. Names, dates, places forming an unbroken line through history. "Why come forward now?" he asked. Nalin was quiet for a moment, watching the fire. "The railroad men survey the valley. The banker speaks of progress, but this land..." She gestured to the dark mountains around them. "It holds memories, stories, The springs where my people gathered for generations. The caves where Thomas and I made our first home. She met Oliver's gaze steadily. Some things should not be lost. The night insects resumed their song, a constant reminder of the wild peace that still existed here. Oliver studied the documents again, understanding now that he had uncovered more than just a curious piece of history. He had found a key to the valley's future, and its rightful guardian stood before him in the firelight. "The banker won't like this," he said finally. "No," Nalin agreed softly. "But truth is truth, whether men like it or not." They remained by the fire as the evening deepened, the documents spread between them like a bridge across time. Oliver felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, knowing that his simple life as a mountain man had changed the moment his spade struck that hidden cavern. The night insects sang their ancient songs, unchanged by Spanish grants or railroad dreams, and in their steady chorus, Oliver heard an echo of Nalin's words. Some things should not be lost. Morning sunlight streamed through the cafe windows, catching dust motes that danced above steaming coffee cups. The breakfast crowd at May's Cafe buzzed with talk of only one thing, the Spanish land grant and its supposed heir. "An Apache widow claiming the whole valley?" Jed Mackenzie slapped his palm on the wooden table, making coffee cups rattle. "It ain't natural." The rancher's weathered face flushed red beneath his hat brim. Around him, other ranchers nodded in agreement, their expressions dark as thunderclouds. The cafe filled with the clink of silverware and the low rumble of angry voices. "What's next?" Tom Wheeler demanded. "Giving away the whole territory." At a corner table, Preacher Josiah Hale set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "The Lord counsels patience," he said, his gentle voice carrying in a momentary lull. "And justice for the widow and orphan." "Justice?" Mackenzie scoffed. "Where's the justice in one woman holding rights to water we all need?" The cafe door opened with a gentle chime as Sarah Miller, the schoolmarm, entered. She paused, taking in the tense atmosphere, then straightened her spine. "Mrs. Crawford has as much right to dignity as any of us," she said firmly, using Nalin's married name. "She's lived here peaceably for years, teaching our children about healing plants and helping birth our babies." "That's different than owning the valley," Wheeler muttered, but he couldn't quite meet the schoolmarm's stern gaze. Outside, Oliver Boone mounted his horse, letting the town's gossip fade behind him as he rode toward the valley's edge. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and pine. His mare's hooves kicked up small clouds of dust along the narrow trail that led to Nalin's cabin. The modest structure came into view, a simple log cabin with a small vegetable garden and herb beds. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and a line of washing fluttered in the breeze. Oliver dismounted, noting how the cabin seemed to nestle naturally into the landscape, as if it had grown there like the surrounding juniper trees. Nalin emerged from the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Boone," she said with a slight nod. "You have come early." "Thought we might look at those papers again," Oliver replied, tying his horse to the hitching post. "Town stirred up something fierce." A shadow crossed Nalin's face, but she gestured him inside. The cabin's interior was neat and clean, with dried herbs hanging from the rafters and a few carefully preserved pieces of furniture. A wooden cross hung beside a traditional Apache medicine pouch, symbols of the two worlds she bridged. "Here," she said, retrieving a carved wooden box from a high shelf. "Thomas kept everything orderly. He said papers were like tracks. They tell where you've been and prove where you belong." They sat at the simple table as Nalin opened the box. Sunlight through the window illuminated each item as she laid them out. The marriage certificate with Thomas Crawford's bold signature, his careful mining records showing claims and purchases, and most precious of all, a rosary of carved olive wood. "This belonged to Isabella Martinez de Crawford," Nalin explained, touching the rosary's worn beads. "Thomas's grandmother." the Spanish officer's wife. Her fingers traced the delicate cross. She gave it to Thomas's mother, who gave it to him. Before he died, he placed it in my hands. Oliver studied the documents, noting how the names linked together like a chain through time. "These mining records," he said, "they show Thomas bought land from some of the original Grant families." Nalin nodded. He understood the old ways of recording such things. When he married me, he made sure everything was proper in the law's eyes. A trace of pain crossed her features. Not that it stopped the talk. The afternoon passed as they examined each piece of evidence. As evening approached, Nalin rose to fetch water. Oliver grabbed the empty buckets before she could protest. "Let me help," he said gruffly. "These are heavy when full." They walked together to the creek, where clear water tumbled over rocks worn smooth by time. As Oliver filled the buckets, Nalin spoke softly of her life in the valley. "The townspeople smile when they need healing herbs," she said, "but turn away at other times. My own people." She paused, watching the water flow. "They say I betrayed our ways by marrying Thomas, by living in a cabin instead of a wickiup, by wearing a cross." She touched the small silver crucifix at her throat. "But Thomas saw me as I was. Not Apache, not white, just Nalin." Oliver straightened, water dripping from the filled buckets. "Folks get scared of what's different," he said. "Makes them mean sometimes." They walked back to the cabin as dusk painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. Inside, Nalin lit the lamp, its gentle glow creating a circle of warmth in the gathering darkness. Without speaking, Nalin knelt beside her bed and began to pray, her words a mixture of Apache and the English prayers Thomas had taught her. After a moment's hesitation, Oliver removed his hat and knelt awkwardly beside her. Together they asked for guidance, strength, and justice, their different traditions blending in the lamplight like harmony in an old hymn. The peaceful moment shattered as hoofbeats thundered through the night. Shouts and laughter echoed from the direction of town, followed by the sharp sound of nails being hammered into wood. "Riders," Oliver said, moving to the window, "posting something on the buildings." Nalin's face was calm, but her hands trembled slightly as she rose. "They will try to say the grant is false, that my claim is a lie." Oliver turned from the window, his expression set with determination. "Then we'll prove your truth," he said firmly. "Every word of it." Nalin looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Truth is like water," she said. "It finds its way through stone." Outside, the riders' hoofbeats faded into the distance, but their actions would greet the town with the dawn. Notices declaring the Spanish land grant a fraud, the Apache widow's claim a deception. Yet in the lamplit cabin, Oliver and Nalin continued their work, sorting through documents and memories, building a foundation of proof that no amount of posted notices could shake. "I'll help you see this through," Oliver said as he prepared to leave. "Whatever comes." Nalin stood in the doorway, the lamplight behind her casting a gentle glow. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thomas would have said you are a good man." Oliver mounted his horse, aware that his solitary life had changed irrevocably. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and unchanging, as he rode back toward his cabin, the weight of his promise settling around his shoulders like a familiar blanket. The wagon wheels creaked beneath them as Oliver guided his team along the rutted path toward his line shack. Nalin sat beside him on the wooden seat, a basket of provisions at her feet. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley, painting the grass in stripes of gold and darkness. "Might be a tight squeeze getting through that opening," Oliver said, pulling the horses to a stop near the ant mound that had started it all. "But reckon there's more down there worth finding." Nalin nodded, gathering her skirts as she climbed down from the wagon. Thomas spoke often of old passages beneath the valley, said the Spanish knew secrets about this land that others had forgotten. Oliver retrieved their supplies, Lanterns, rope, picks, and canvas bags. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from the basket Nayland had packed, along with cornbread and dried meat. They would need the strength for the work ahead. The morning air was cool as they approached the cavern entrance. Oliver had shored up the sides with timber supports, making it safer to descend. He lit both lanterns, handing one to Nayland. "Watch your step," he cautioned, leading the way down. "Ground's uneven here." The lantern light threw dancing shadows on the rock walls. Their boots scraped against loose stones as they made their way deeper into the chamber. The musty scent of earth and age filled their nostrils. "Look there," Nayland said, pointing to where the wall showed signs of tool marks. "Someone worked to hide this place." Oliver ran his hand along the scored stone. "Aye, and did a fair job of it, too." He lifted his lantern higher, examining the chamber's ceiling. But they left signs for those who knew where to look. They moved carefully through the space, noting how the walls had been shaped to direct water flow. Oliver's experienced eye caught subtle marks that others might miss: carved arrows, crosses, and symbols that seemed to point deeper into the earth. Near the back wall, a stone slab sat slightly proud of its neighbors. Oliver set down his lantern and ran his fingers along its edges. "This one's different," he muttered. "Feels like it was meant to move." He retrieved a pry bar from their supplies and wedged it into a slight gap. The stone resisted at first, then gave way with a grinding sound that echoed through the chamber. Dust billowed up, catching the lantern light like golden snow. "Hold the light steady," Oliver said, shifting the heavy slab aside. Beneath it lay another oilskin bundle, similar to the first but larger. Nayland knelt beside him as he carefully unwrapped the package. Inside, they found more parchments, but these were different from the land grant documents. These were maps, drawn with precise detail, showing the valley from above and below. "Watermarks," Nayland breathed, tracing the blue lines that crisscrossed the yellowed paper. "Springs and channels running beneath the surface." Her finger followed a particular line. "This one. Thomas told me stories of an underground river that never ran dry, even in the worst drought." Oliver spread the maps carefully on a flat rock. "These would be worth more than gold to some folks," he said quietly, explaining why they were hidden so well. They spent hours examining the documents, Nayland translating snippets of Spanish text that described water sources and seasonal flows. The maps showed how the ancient springs connected, forming a hidden network that sustained the valley's life. When they finally emerged from the cavern, the sun had passed its peak. They blinked in the bright light, their clothes dusty from their underground exploration. Standing near their wagon was Sarah Miller, the schoolmarm, her buggy parked nearby. "I hoped I might find you here," Sarah said, stepping forward. Her black widow's dress was stark against the golden grass. "Word travels fast in small towns, and she hesitated, then straightened her shoulders. "I want to help." Oliver and Nayland exchanged glances. Sarah Miller was known for her fairness, one of the few townspeople who had consistently treated Nayland with respect. "I was trained in cartography before I came west to teach," Sarah continued. "I could make copies of any important documents, careful copies that would preserve the originals while providing proof for the courts." Nayland studied the schoolmarm's earnest face. "Why would you help me?" "Because it's right," Sarah said simply, "and because I know what it's like to face the world alone after losing a husband." She smiled slightly. "Besides, my students have learned more about healing plants from you than they ever would from books." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows as they made their way to Oliver's shack. While Sarah began her careful work at the rough-hewn table, Oliver built up the fire and set about preparing their evening meal, the simple cabin filled with the aroma of cooking beans and fresh cornbread. Nayland added wild herbs she had gathered, their sharp scent mixing with the wood smoke. The three of them worked in comfortable silence, each absorbed in their tasks. As darkness fell, they gathered around the table to eat. The flames from the hearth cast a warm glow, making the cabin feel almost cozy despite its sparse furnishings. Sarah's precise copies were spread out to dry, looking remarkably like the originals. "My husband used to say that faith without works is dead," Sarah said, breaking her cornbread. "It's not enough to pray for justice. We must work for it too." Nalin nodded slowly. Thomas believed the same. He said the law was like a tool, useful only in hands that meant to build something good. "Reckon that's true enough," Oliver added, scraping his plate. "Seen plenty of men use the law like a weapon instead of a shield." They talked quietly as they ate, speaking of faith and fairness, of how the valley had enough water for all if people would share instead of grab. Outside, the night deepens, stars appearing one by one in the darkening sky. A sudden sound made them pause, the distant rhythm of hoofbeats, then silence. Oliver moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. Nothing moved in the shadows, but the night felt watched, as if unseen eyes marked their every move. "Someone's keeping track of us," he said quietly, returning to the table. "Best be careful with those maps." Sarah gathered her copies with steady hands. "I'll keep them safe," she promised. "Hidden among my school records where no one would think to look." Nalin touched one of the original maps gently. "These show the truth of the land," she said softly. "The way water flows beneath, connecting all things, like the truth itself, hidden but always there." The hoofbeats came again, more distant now, fading into the night. But their presence had changed something in the cabin's atmosphere. What had been a quiet evening of shared purpose now felt like the calm before a storm. Oliver built up the fire one last time, its warmth pushing back against the growing chill. They would need to be careful now, guarding both the maps and their hopes for justice. But looking at his companions in the firelight, the dignified Apache widow and the determined schoolmarm, he felt a surge of quiet strength. Sometimes, he reflected, the truth found its defenders in the most unexpected places. Sunday dawned clear and bright, the morning sun casting long shadows across the valley. Dew sparkled on the grass as wagons and riders made their way toward the river bend, where preacher Josiah Hale had set up for the baptism service. The water flowed gentle and clear, perfect for the sacred occasion. Oliver adjusted his freshly pressed shirt collar, feeling somewhat out of place in his cleaned-up appearance. He'd spent an extra hour that morning trying to tame his usually wild beard and hair. As he approached the gathering, he spotted Nalin standing slightly apart from the main crowd, wearing a simple dark dress with a shawl draped over her shoulders. The townsfolk had spread blankets on the grassy bank, children running barefoot while their parents set up baskets of food for the after-service dinner on the grounds. The sound of hymns singing drifted across the water as Preacher Hale organized the baptism candidates near the shore. "Brother Oliver," the preacher called out warmly, "glad you could join us today." Oliver nodded, making his way to stand near Nalin. He noticed how some of the ranchers' wives pulled their children closer, whispering behind raised hands. The ranch hands clustered together, their expressions dark as thunderclouds. "You didn't have to come," Nalin said softly, her eyes fixed on the water. "Reckon I did," Oliver replied, his voice equally quiet. "The Lord's water flows for everyone." Preacher Hale raised his hands for attention, his Bible held high. "Brothers and sisters," he called out, his voice carrying across the crowd. "We gather today to witness new souls declaring their faith in Jesus Christ. As it says in Matthew, 'Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them.'" The first candidates were settler children, stepping into the water in their white clothes. Among them stood 2 Apache children, their dark eyes serious as they waited their turn. Oliver heard muttering from the ranchers' section, but Preacher Hale's voice rose above it all, steady and sure. "In the eyes of our Lord, all souls are precious," the preacher declared, helping a small girl into the water. All are welcome at his table. The baptisms proceeded one by one, each soul welcomed into God's family with prayer and song. The settler children and native children alike emerged from the water to cheers and amens, their faces glowing with joy. Mothers wrapped them in quilts, and fathers clapped proud hands on small shoulders. Oliver felt something shift in his chest as he watched. It had been years since he'd attended such a gathering, not since. He pushed the memory away, but Nalin must have sensed his unease. Her hand brushed his arm, a touch so light it might have been the wind. The afternoon sun warmed the valley as families spread their dinner blankets. Children played together, their wet hair drying in the breeze, the boundaries between settler and native temporarily forgotten in the simple joy of youth. The sound of laughter mixed with the river's song. As evening approached, the gathering moved to the white-painted church at the edge of town. Lanterns were lit, their golden light spilling from the windows as people filed inside for the evening service. Oliver hesitated at the door, but Nalin's presence beside him gave him courage to enter. The small church filled with the sound of familiar hymns. Oliver found himself remembering words he thought he'd forgotten, his deep voice joining the others in "Amazing Grace" and "Shall we gather at the river?" Nalin hummed beside him, her clear tone weaving through the melody. After the service, as people began to disperse into the growing darkness, Oliver fell into step beside Nalin for the walk to her cabin. The evening air was cool, crickets chirping in the grass alongside the path. Stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, their boots crunching on the packed earth. Finally, Oliver spoke, his voice rough with memory. "Had a family once," he said, the words coming slowly. "Wife named Mary. 2 little ones, Sarah and James." He paused, drawing a deep breath. "Fever took them, 15 years ago come winter. Wasn't nothing to be done but watch them slip away." Nalin's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers warm and strong. She didn't speak, but her grip conveyed more understanding than words could express. "After that, couldn't stand being around people much," Oliver continued. "Took to the mountains, trapping and hunting. Figured I'd live out my days alone." He glanced at her profile in the starlight. "Funny how the Lord works." "Thomas used to say that grief is like the river," Nalin replied softly. "It carries us to new shores, even when we think we are lost." They reached her cabin, its dark shape outlined against the night sky. A single lantern burned in the window, welcoming them home. Oliver helped her up the steps, their hands still linked. At the door, Nalin turned to face him. "Thank you," she said simply, "for standing with me today." Oliver nodded, unable to find the right words. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken understanding. From the shadows near the corral came the sharp sound of tobacco juice hitting dirt. Ranch foreman Wade Tucker stepped into view, his face hard in the lantern light. He touched the brim of his hat with mock politeness. "Evening, Ms. Nalin," he drawled, his tone carrying a edge. "Mighty fine service today, wasn't it?" His boots scraped against the packed earth as he moved past them, disappearing into the darkness. Oliver waited until Nalin was safely inside before turning toward home. The night had grown cooler, but he barely noticed the chill. His mind was full of hymns and memories, of small hands held in baptismal waters, of Nalin's fingers wrapped around his own. Perhaps, he thought, the Lord hadn't finished with him yet. The stars wheeled overhead as he walked, their eternal light casting soft shadows across the sleeping valley. Behind him, Nalin's lantern glowed like a beacon in the darkness, guiding him forward even as he turned away. The first hint of dawn had barely touched the eastern sky when Oliver jerked awake in his bunk. Something wasn't right. The air held a bitter tang that made his throat tighten. Smoke. He threw off his blanket and rushed to the window, his heart hammering against his ribs. An orange glow painted the pre-dawn darkness near the cavern site. Flames licked the sky, casting grotesque shadows across the rocky ground. Oliver grabbed his coat and ran for the stable, his boots crunching on frost-covered grass. His horse nickered nervously as he threw on the saddle, fingers fumbling with buckles in his haste. "Easy there, girl," he muttered, leading her out into the yard. The smoke was thicker now, carried on the morning breeze. Oliver swung into the saddle and urged his mount forward, racing toward the inferno. The closer he got, the worse it looked. Someone had stacked dry brush around the cavern entrance and set it ablaze. The supporting timbers he'd installed were already catching, threatening to bring down the whole opening. Heat slapped his face as he dismounted, searching desperately for any sign of water barrels or tools. "Oliver!" Nolan's voice cut through the roar of flames. She appeared from the darkness, leading her own horse. "I saw the fire from my window." "Stay back!" he shouted. But she was already rushing forward, her shawl pulled over her nose and mouth. Together they grabbed the water buckets he kept near his tool shed, but it was like throwing drops on a wildfire. A sharp crack split the air. One of the main support beams gave way, sending sparks shooting skyward. Oliver's heart seized. The parchments were still inside, along with the crates of artifacts they'd discovered. "We have to get them out," Nolan said, reading his thoughts. Before he could stop her, she darted toward the entrance, ducking under the smoke. Oliver cursed and followed, keeping low where the air was clearest. Heat pressed against them like a living thing, hungry and malevolent. They found the strongbox where they'd stored the grant papers, but flames were already eating at the nearest crate of Spanish coins. "Leave them!" Oliver grabbed Nolan's arm as she reached for a smaller box of relics. "The roof's coming down!" They half ran, half crawled toward the entrance, clutching their precious cargo. Behind them, timbers groaned and snapped. Oliver pushed Nolan ahead of him just as a burning beam crashed down. White-hot pain scored across his upper arm, but he kept moving. They burst out into the cool morning air, gasping and coughing. Oliver's lungs felt scraped raw. Nolan's face was streaked with soot, but her arms were wrapped protectively around the strongbox containing the grant papers. Dawn had fully broken now, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of purple and gold. The sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of townsfolk, drawn by the commotion. Among them rode banker Silas Rourke, his usual impeccable appearance somewhat disheveled by the early hour. "My word," someone muttered. "Would you look at that?" "Arson. Plain as day," another voice added. "Who'd do such a thing?" The banker dismounted, his boots raising little puffs of dust as he approached. His eyes fixed on the strongbox in Nolan's arms, then shifted to the burning cavern entrance. A slight smile touched his lips. "How convenient," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The very evidence in question, mysteriously preserved while everything else burns." He turned to address the gathering crowd. "One might almost think it was planned that way." Nolan stiffened beside Oliver. "What are you suggesting?" "Only that some might find it suspicious when a claimant destroys the very site that could prove or disprove their case." Rourke's voice dripped false concern. "After all, now we have only your word about what was found here." "That's a lie!" Oliver stepped forward, but pain flared in his injured arm, making him stumble. "We'll let the law decide," Rourke replied smoothly. He turned to Judge Crowell, who had just arrived on his old brown mare. "Your Honor, given these suspicious circumstances, I move for an immediate hearing on the validity of these claims." The judge surveyed the scene, his weathered face grave. Smoke still rose from the cavern mouth, and the acrid smell of burning wood filled the air. Finally, he nodded. "Court will convene tomorrow at 10 o'clock, he announced. "All interested parties will present their evidence." He fixed Nolan with a stern look. "I trust you'll be prepared to explain these circumstances, madam." The crowd began to disperse as the fire died down, leaving behind whispers and sidelong glances. Oliver watched them go, noting how none offered to help salvage what remained. Only the schoolmarm lingered, pressing a clean handkerchief into Nalan's hand before departing. The sun was well up by the time they'd done what they could. The cavern entrance was a blackened ruin, the precious artifacts inside either burned or buried under fallen rock. Oliver's arm throbbed where the beam had struck him, the sleeve of his shirt scorched and bloodied. They retreated to his cabin, both too exhausted to speak much. Nalan insisted on tending his wound, her gentle hands cleaning and binding the burn with strips torn from her petticoat. The familiar scent of her herbal salve filled the small room, mingling with wood smoke from their clothes. "You should rest," she said, tying off the bandage. Oliver shook his head. "No time. We need to prepare for tomorrow." He pulled paper and ink from his desk drawer, wincing at the movement. "Tell me everything again, from the beginning. Every detail matters now." Nalan knelt beside his chair, her face composed despite the morning's trauma. "I will not hide from their accusations," she said firmly. "My husband taught me to face injustice with dignity. The truth is on our side." Oliver dipped his pen in ink, trying to keep his hand steady. Outside, the sun climbed higher, promising another hot day. Inside, the lamp cast warm light across his rough-hewn table as Nalan began to speak, her voice clear and strong despite her exhaustion. "I was born in the shadow of these mountains," she began. "My mother's people have known these waters since before the Spanish came." Oliver wrote carefully, capturing every word. The scratch of his pen filled the quiet cabin as morning deepened toward noon. He would not let lies and fire destroy what was right. The truth would be recorded, word by word, in black ink on white paper. It was all they had left now. The strongbox sat between them on the table, its contents safe but smelling of smoke. Through the window, they could still see wisps of dark smoke rising from the cavern site, a stark reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything. But they hadn't lost it all. Not yet. Not while they still had breath to speak the truth and strength to face whatever came next. Morning sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the packed benches. The wood-paneled room hummed with whispers as townsfolk filed in, their Sunday best doing little to hide their unease. Oliver tugged at his borrowed collar, feeling every eye upon him as he took his place near the front. Judge Crowell sat straight-backed behind his heavy oak desk, his face as weathered as old leather. The American flag hung limp behind him in the still air. To one side, banker Silas Rourke adjusted his silk tie, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Nalan entered with quiet dignity, her dark skirts rustling softly. She had traded her usual shawl for a high-necked blouse, her hair neatly braided. A few children from the mission school waved timidly, but their parents quickly stilled their hands. The judge's gavel cracked like a gunshot. "Court is now in session." His voice filled the room. "We're here to examine evidence regarding Spanish land grant claims in Willow Creek Valley." Banker Rourke rose first, his polished boots gleaming. "Your Honor, I represent the financial interests of this community." He paced before the bench, each step measured. "What we face here is nothing less than attempted fraud on a massive scale." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Oliver's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. "This woman," Rourke continued, gesturing toward Nalan, "conveniently produces documents that would give her control of our most valuable water rights. Documents that appeared, as if by magic, in a cave." His voice dripped with skepticism. "And when questions arise about their authenticity, that same cave mysteriously burns." "That fire was set!" Oliver burst out, half rising from his seat. "Order," Judge Crowell warned, rapping his gavel. "You'll have your turn, Mr. Boone." The railroad surveyor spoke next, a thin man with ink-stained fingers. "Your Honor, the proposed rail line is vital to this territory's future. We cannot allow progress to be derailed by dubious claims." He unfurled a map across the judge's desk. This valley is the only viable route through the mountains. Oliver watched Nalin's face as the morning wore on. She sat straight-backed, hands folded in her lap, while speaker after speaker questioned her character, her heritage, her right to be heard at all. Only the slight tremor in her fingers betrayed her emotion. When Oliver's turn came, he spoke plainly of finding the cavern, of unearthing the documents. "I've trapped these mountains 15 years, he said. "I know truth when I see it. These papers are real as the sun rising." Taza shuffled forward next, his ancient eyes bright beneath silver hair. "The seals," he said in careful English, "are those of Spanish governors who dealt with our fathers' fathers. I have seen their like before, in the old places." He touched the faded wax marks with reverent fingers. "These speak truth." But Rourke was ready. He produced a telegram from Santa Fe. "Experts question these seals," he announced. "They suggest skilled forgery, and given yesterday's convenient fire." He turned to the judge. "We move that the defendant be held for further investigation." The courthouse erupted in shouted arguments. Judge Crowell's gavel cracked again and again. "Silence!" he roared. When quiet fell, he studied the papers before him for long moments. Oliver held his breath. The judge's face was unreadable as stone. "Given the serious nature of these accusations," Crowell said finally, "and the suspicious circumstances surrounding the fire, I have no choice." He cleared his throat. "Nayland Yazzie is to be held in custody pending further investigation of possible fraud and arson." "No!" The cry came from several children near the back. Their teacher tried to quiet them, but their distress was plain. 2 deputies stepped forward with iron shackles. Oliver started to rise, but Nayland caught his eye and shook her head slightly. She offered her wrists with quiet dignity, though Oliver saw how they trembled. The sound of chains clicking shut echoed in the sudden hush. Children began to cry as Nalin was led toward the door. "She helped my mama when we were sick," one little girl called out. "She's good." "Miss Nayland taught me to read," another voice piped up. "Order! Order in this court!" The judge's gavel couldn't quite drown out the children's protests. Oliver watched helplessly as Nalin was led away. The banker's satisfied smile made his blood boil, but he forced himself to stay calm. Getting himself arrested wouldn't help her now. The autumn day faded quickly into evening. Oliver stood outside the jail's barred window, the cooling air carrying the scent of wood smoke from distant homestead fires. Inside, Nayland sat on a narrow cot, her face half hidden in shadow. "I brought some stew," Oliver said softly. "The cafe owner's wife made it special." He passed a cloth-wrapped bundle through the bars. "Sarah has a kind heart," Nayland replied. "Please thank her for me." She unwrapped the bundle slowly, her chains clinking. "This ain't right," Oliver growled. "You're no criminal. My husband warned me this might happen." Nayland's voice was steady, despite her circumstances. "The night before he died, he told me, 'Stand in courage, no matter their hate.' He knew what claiming our rights might cost." Oliver gripped the iron bars until his knuckles whitened. "I won't abandon you," he promised. "We'll prove the truth." "Truth has a way of coming to light," Nayland said softly, "like water from a hidden spring." She moved closer to the window, her face catching the last rays of sunset. "My people have endured worse than jail cells. This too shall pass." The jail bell tolled the evening hour, its deep note rolling across the darkening town. One by one, lamps flickered to life in distant windows. The night settled heavy over Willow Flats, full of unspoken fears and uncertain futures. Oliver stayed until the deputy warned him away. As he walked through the gathering darkness, the sound of hymn singing drifted from the mission school. The children's voices rose sweet and clear. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. He paused to listen, remembering how those same young voices had cried out for Nalin's innocence. Perhaps there was hope yet, if children could still see truth so clearly. The jail bell tolled once more, a somber reminder of justice delayed, but, God willing, Not denied. Dawn painted the valley in soft rose and gold as Oliver saddled his horse. He had a list of names in his pocket, folks who'd seen firsthand how Nayland had helped others through hard times. The leather creaked beneath him as he rode toward town, determination set firm in his weathered face. His first stop was the whitewashed church where Preacher Josiah already bent over dusty books, his silver hair catching early light through tall windows. "These records go back 20 years, the preacher said, turning brittle pages with careful fingers. "If that grant was registered, we'll find it." Oliver nodded gratefully. "Much obliged, preacher. I'm heading to see Miss Sarah at the schoolhouse next." The schoolmarm welcomed him with quiet efficiency, her spectacles glinting. "The children are already gathering signatures," she said, smoothing her apron. "So many remember how Nayland helped during the drought of '82, shared her corn, tended the sick without asking payment." Throughout the day, Oliver rode from farm to farm. Widow Jensen recalled how Nayland had saved her youngest from fever. The Cooper boys spoke of her teaching them to find water in dry creek beds. Even gruff old Baker admitted she'd shared medicine when his wife was ailing. As sunset painted the church windows, amber, Oliver led a gathering of supporters into the quiet sanctuary. Farmers with calloused hands sat beside weather-worn widows. The schoolmarm's students had brought their parents. All spoke in hushed voices of Nayland's quiet strength and generosity. "We'll testify to her character," Widow Jensen declared, clutching her shawl. "The judge must listen to honest folk." A cry from the vestry interrupted their planning. "Oliver, come quickly!" Preacher Josiah's voice rang with excitement. They found him kneeling before an old chest, a leather-bound ledger open in his trembling hands. Lamplight caught the careful script filling its pages. "Look here," he said, finger-tracing entries from years past. "It's signed by James Yazzie, Nayland's husband. He registered the Spanish grant with the church before he died." Oliver's breath caught as he read the precise handwriting. There it was. Proof that Nayland's husband had known about the grant, had acted to protect it. The preacher's eyes shone as Oliver clasped his hand in gratitude. Later that night, Oliver knelt beside his narrow bed in the line shack. "Lord," he whispered, "give us strength to see justice done." The wind moaned around the eaves, and somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called, a lonely sound that seemed to echo his own heart's yearning for right to prevail. Through his small window, he could see the lights of town, knowing Nayland waited behind iron bars, trusting in truth to break her chains. The wind gusted stronger, rustling papers on his table, like pages of history turning toward tomorrow's justice. Dawn painted the sky in streaks of pale rose as Oliver Boone made his way down the empty streets of Willow Flats. The leather-bound church ledger was tucked safely inside his coat, pressed against his heart like a shield. His boots kicked up dust with each determined step toward the courthouse, where Judge Abner would be arriving early to review cases. The morning air held a bite of autumn chill. Shop owners were just beginning to sweep their wooden sidewalks as Oliver climbed the courthouse steps. Inside, lamp oil and old paper scented the dim hallway. He found Judge Abner already at his desk, wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose as he sorted through documents. "Your Honor," Oliver said, removing his hat. "Found something you need to see." The judge looked up, his weathered face creasing with interest as Oliver withdrew the ledger. "What's this, then?" "Church records. The preacher discovered it last night." Oliver's rough fingers carefully opened to the marked page. "Shows Nayland's husband registered the Spanish grant years ago. His own writing, clear as day." Judge Abner leaned forward, adjusting his spectacles. "Well now, this could change matters considerably." He reached for the ledger, but movement in the doorway made them both look up. Banker Silas Rourke stood there, impeccable in his pressed suit despite the early hour. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, more evidence appears. How convenient." He gestured, and 2 deputy marshals stepped into view behind him. "Judge," Rourke said smoothly, These men need to log that ledger as evidence. Standard procedure, you understand. Oliver's hand tightened on the book. Seems mighty peculiar, banker, you being here right now. I keep early hours, Mr. Boone. Banking requires diligence. Rourke nodded to the deputies. Take custody of that ledger. The judge cleared his throat. Now see here. But the deputies were already moving forward. Oliver backed away, clutching the precious evidence. This stays with me till the hearing. Obstruction of justice, Rourke tutted. Deputies, do your duty. What happened next was a blur. Oliver ducked past them and ran, boots pounding down the hallway. He burst out into the street, hearing shouts behind him. He cut down an alley between the general store and the smithy, hoping to circle back to the church. Heavy footsteps followed. Oliver was halfway down the narrow passage when something struck his legs from behind. He sprawled forward, twisting to protect the ledger as he fell. Pain exploded in his side as boots connected with his ribs. Hand it over, mountain man, a gruff voice demanded. Oliver curled around the book, taking the blows. Through the haze of pain, he heard Rourke's voice. Don't mark his face. Make it look like a simple robbery. More kicks landed. Oliver tasted blood, but his arms remained locked around the ledger, his body a fortress protecting truth. Finally, the assault ceased. Forget it, one deputy muttered. Sun's getting high. Too many folks about now. Footsteps retreated. Oliver lay there, breathing shallow, each intake sending spikes of agony through his chest. Several minutes passed before he could push himself up against the alley wall. His hat lay crushed nearby, but the ledger was safe, if somewhat dirty. The morning crowd was gathering on the street as he limped toward the jail. Inside, he found Nalin already awake, kneeling in prayer by her narrow cot. She gasped when she saw him. Oliver! Your face! She rushed to the bars, reaching through to touch his bruised cheek. Had a disagreement with some deputies, he said, trying to smile despite his split lip. But look what I saved. He carefully pulled out the ledger. Tears welled in Nalin's dark eyes as she took the book through the bars. Her fingers traced the familiar handwriting of her late husband. Thank you, she whispered, both to Oliver and heaven. God is good, even in darkness. Oliver settled onto the wooden chair by her cell, ribs protesting. Banker tried to make it disappear, but truth has a way of staying alive. Nalin clutched the ledger to her chest like a precious thing. My husband believed in keeping careful records. He said someday they might matter. She smiled through her tears. He was right. Throughout the day, word spread through town about Oliver's beating. The schoolmarm, flame-haired and fierce, marched straight to the printing press. By afternoon, notices were posted on every corner, citizens of Willow Flats. Your presence is required at tomorrow's hearing, to stand witness for truth and justice. Let your conscience guide you. God is watching. Oliver spent the day resting at the jail, keeping watch over Nalin and the ledger. The preacher brought them both food and fresh water, tending to Oliver's wounds with gentle hands. As evening settled over the valley, Oliver finally made his way home. His line shack looked lonely in the gathering dusk. He eased himself onto the porch chair, rifle laid across his knees. His ribs ached with each breath, but his spirit was steady. In the hills beyond town, pinpricks of torchlight began to appear, ranchers' camps gathering like malevolent fireflies. He watched those distant flames, remembering Nalin's words about God's presence even in darkness. The ledger was safely hidden now, ready for tomorrow's hearing. His body might be battered, but truth remained unbroken. Through the pain, he felt a quiet certainty. Light would overcome shadow if good people stood firm. The night deepened around him as he kept his vigil. More torches appeared in the hills, but Oliver held his ground. Tomorrow would decide the valley's fate. Tonight, he would guard the borders of hope with weary eyes and loaded rifle, trusting in the power of truth to prevail. Across town in her cell, Nalin knelt in prayer beneath barred windows. In the hills, ranchers plotted by firelight. And between them all, a solitary mountain man sat watching, believing that justice, like dawn, would eventually break through the dark. Gray clouds hung low over Willow Flats as the first light of dawn crept across the valley. The air felt heavy with moisture and tension, matching the somber mood of this crucial morning. By 7 o'clock, wagons began rolling into town, their wooden wheels creaking against the packed dirt of Main Street. Within an hour, the usual quiet of the street had transformed into a sea of activity. Oliver Boone stood at the window of his boarding house room, watching the gathering crowd below. His ribs still ached from the beating, and patches of purple-blue decorated his side, but determination burned stronger than pain. The church ledger lay wrapped in oilskin on his bed, ready for its moment in court. Outside, ranch hands wearing gun belts clustered in tight groups, their faces hard as they watched Apache families making their way toward the courthouse. The native people walked with quiet dignity, women in their finest shawls, men in clean shirts, children clinging to their mothers' skirts. Taza moved among them like a steadying presence, his silver hair catching the weak morning light. The schoolmarm had organized several town wives to bring chairs and benches from their homes, arranging them in rows inside the courthouse. By 9 o'clock, the building was packed to bursting. The air grew thick with the smell of wet wool coats and nervous sweat. Oliver found a spot near the front, nodding to the preacher who sat with the precious ledger now in his keeping. At precisely 9:30, Judge Abner Crowell entered, his black robes sweeping behind him. The room fell silent as he took his seat, adjusting his spectacles with deliberate care. "Bring in the accused," he commanded. The side door opened, and Nalin appeared between two deputies. Despite her days in jail, she walked with her head high, her dark eyes clear and unafraid. She wore a clean calico dress someone had brought her, her long black hair neatly braided. Oliver felt his heart swell with admiration at her quiet strength. Banker Silas Rourke sat at the prosecution table, immaculate in his pin-striped suit. His thin lips curved in a dismissive smile as Nalin was seated. "Your Honor," he began, rising smoothly to his feet, "we're gathered here to expose a fraudulent claim on valuable territory, a deception perpetrated by—" "If you please," Judge Crowell interrupted, "we'll begin with the evidence." He nodded to Oliver. "Mr. Boone, you may present your findings." Oliver stood, ignoring the twinge in his ribs. His voice carried clearly through the packed room as he recounted discovering the cave, the Spanish documents, and finally, the ledger. "Your Honor, the preacher can verify the church records." Preacher Josiah Hale approached the bench, the leather-bound book cradled carefully in his hands. "These are our official records, Your Honor, kept faithfully for 20 years. He opened to the marked page. Here, dated 1872, is the entry in Thomas Crawford's own hand, registering the Spanish land grant he inherited through marriage to Nalin's family. The judge leaned forward, studying the neat script. "And you can confirm this is the deceased Mr. Crawford's handwriting?" "Yes, sir." The preacher pulled out several letters from his coat. "I have other examples of his writing here, from when he served as church secretary. They match perfectly." A murmur ran through the crowd. Banker Rourke's face tightened. "Circumstantial evidence at best," he declared. "We have no proof these documents weren't forged years ago." "If I may, Your Honor." Taza rose from his seat, his weathered face dignified. The room grew still as the Apache elder made his way forward. He spoke in clear, measured English. "Our people have passed down the story of these Spanish grants for 4 generations. I learned it from my grandfather, who learned it from his father before him. The seals, the boundaries, the sacred springs, all match our oral history exactly." "Convenient tales," Rourke scoffed. "Hardly legal evidence." On the contrary, Judge Crowell said quietly. Tribal testimony has been accepted in territorial courts before. He studied the documents spread before him, the Spanish grant, the church ledger, Crawford's letters. The room seemed to hold its breath. After what felt like hours, the judge removed his spectacles and surveyed the crowded courthouse. The evidence before me appears authentic and properly registered. The continuous chain of inheritance is clear, from the original Spanish grant through Mr. Crawford's marriage, into the rightful tribal family, and now to his widow. He paused as another murmur swept the room. Furthermore, attempts have been made to suppress and destroy this evidence, attempts that speak to its legitimacy. His stern gaze swept over the banker and his allies. Therefore, I have no choice but to declare these documents valid and legally binding. The land claim of Mrs. Nayland Crawford is upheld by this court. For a moment, perfect silence filled the room. Then a cheer erupted from the town wives and settlers who had supported Nalin. The Apache families embraced each other, tears flowing freely. But at the back of the room, ranch hands slammed their fists on the wooden benches, faces dark with fury. "This is an outrage!" one foreman shouted. "You can't give American land to—" "Order!" Judge Crowell's gavel crashed down. "This is a court of law, and my ruling stands." He nodded to a deputy. "Send for the soldiers from Fort Bradley." "I want peace kept in this town." Banker Rourke stood, his composure finally cracking. "You've doomed this valley's future, Crowell. The railroad will never. The railroad will need to negotiate with the legal owner of these water rights," the judge cut in firmly. "That owner is Mrs. Crawford. This hearing is concluded." As the gavel fell a final time, Oliver made his way to Nalin. She stood trembling slightly, overwhelmed by the moment. Tears spilled down her cheeks as the deputies removed her shackles. "Thank you," she whispered, touching Oliver's bruised cheek with gentle fingers. "You stood by me when no one else would." "Truth needed defending," he said simply, "and you needed a friend." By late afternoon, a detachment of cavalry had arrived from the fort, their blue uniforms a stark reminder of federal authority. They patrolled the streets as the crowd slowly dispersed. Angry voices and threats could still be heard from the saloon, but the soldiers' presence kept violence in check. As evening painted the sky in deep purple, Oliver walked beside Nalin through the guarded street toward her cabin. The schoolmarm and several other women accompanied them, carrying baskets of food and supplies to help Nalin resettle. Behind them, Taza and the preacher followed, speaking quietly of healing and reconciliation. At her door, Nalin turned to face the small group. "My husband believed in building bridges between peoples," she said softly. "Perhaps now, with God's help, we can begin." The women hugged her, and Taza blessed the threshold in his native tongue. As darkness fell, Oliver watched from the porch as lanterns were lit inside, transforming the simple cabin into a beacon of hope. Justice had prevailed, but he knew the real work of bringing peace to the valley was just beginning. The night air carried the distant sound of cavalry bugles playing evening colors. Stars began to pierce the clouds overhead, their eternal light shining down on victor and vanquished alike. In the streets of Willow Flats, soldiers continued their patrols, guarding the fragile peace of a community forever changed by truth revealed and justice served. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Oliver guided his horse along the creek bed. Behind him, 3 surveyors from the territorial office consulted the newly discovered map, marking locations with wooden stakes. Their brass instruments glinted in the early light as they measured distances and angles with careful precision. "Another spring marked here," called out the lead surveyor, tapping his pencil against the weathered parchment. "Should be just beyond that rise." Oliver dismounted, his boots crunching on dry grass. He could see Nylon approaching from the east, leading several farmwives carrying shovels and picks. The women had tied their skirts up practical-like, ready for the day's work. Their faces showed both hope and determination. The old ones spoke true. Nalin said softly as she reached Oliver's side. She knelt and pressed her palm against the dusty earth. The water runs deep beneath, waiting to be freed. Throughout the morning, more families arrived with tools and water barrels. Children scampered between the adults, eager to help. Oliver organized the men into teams, showing them where to dig the initial channels that would guide the spring water across the land. "Careful now," he instructed, demonstrating the proper angle with his own shovel. "We want these channels deep enough to flow steady, but not so steep they'll flood come the rains." The sound of metal striking earth filled the air as dozens of people worked side by side, settlers and Apache families united in common purpose. Nalin moved among them, sharing her people's knowledge of the land's natural patterns. She showed them how to read the subtle signs that revealed where water wanted to flow. By midday, the first spring had been uncovered. Clear water bubbled up from the ground, catching the sunlight like scattered diamonds. Sarah Jensen, a widow who had struggled for years to irrigate her small vegetable plot, fell to her knees beside the flowing water. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "It's like Moses striking the rock." The children were the first to celebrate, splashing in the growing puddles and painting their faces with mud. Their laughter rang across the valley, infectious in its pure joy. Even the most hardened farmers couldn't help but smile at their antics. Throughout the afternoon, more springs were discovered and channels extended. Oliver worked alongside everyone else, his shirt soaked with honest sweat. He caught glimpses of Nalin as she helped direct the water's course, her quiet confidence drawing respect from those who had once shunned her. As the sun began to set, Preacher Josiah called everyone to gather beneath the old cottonwood trees. The massive trees had stood sentinel over the valley for generations, their leaves whispering in the evening breeze. Nearly 100 people formed a circle, their faces glowing in the golden light. "Let us lift our voices in thanksgiving," the preacher said, raising his worn hymnal. "For the Lord has blessed this land with living water, and blessed us with the wisdom to share it justly." The familiar notes of Amazing Grace rose into the twilight air. Oliver stood near the back, not singing himself, but deeply moved by the harmony of voices, English words and Apache prayers blending together in gratitude. He watched Nalin across the circle, noticed how she seemed to stand taller now, accepted at last by the community. After the impromptu service, families began heading home, carrying water in barrels to fill their cisterns. The newly dug channels gleamed like silver ribbons in the fading light, promising life to the parched earth. Oliver found himself walking beside Nalin as she headed back to her cabin. They moved in comfortable silence, both tired but content with the day's work. At her door, she turned to him. "Will you share supper?" she asked simply. "There is venison stew." Inside, the cabin was warm and welcoming. Nalin lit the lamp while Oliver set out tin plates and cups. The stew's rich aroma filled the small space as they sat across from each other at her rough-hewn table. "I never thought to see such a day," Nalin said softly, breaking bread between them. "My husband dreamed of water flowing free for all, but few would listen then." Oliver nodded, choosing his words carefully. "Reckon sometimes truth needs time to rise, like them springs we uncovered today." They talked quietly as they ate, speaking of practical things, which homesteads would receive water next, how to ensure fair distribution, ways to heal the rifts between neighbors. Yet beneath the simple words lay deeper currents of understanding. Oliver found himself sharing memories he'd kept buried for years, of his wife Mary teaching their daughter to read by lamplight, of his son's first attempts to ride. The pain was still there, but somehow easier to bear in the gentle light of Nalin's attention. She in turn spoke of her own losses, her mother's early death, the rejection by her tribe when she married Thomas, the lonely years after his passing. Yet her words held no bitterness, only quiet strength and hope for better days ahead. As the evening deepened, Oliver rose reluctantly to leave. At the door, he paused, struck by how different everything felt from the solitary existence he'd known for so long. The valley spread before him, dotted with pinpoints of light from cabin windows and cooking fires. Each spark of brightness seemed to echo the warmth he felt in his own heart. "Thank you," he said simply, turning to Nalin, "for the meal and for showing us all a better way." She smiled, a rare, full smile that transformed her serious face. "Thank you for believing when others would not." Oliver walked slowly home through the starlit night, aware that something fundamental had shifted in his world. The crushing loneliness that had driven him to the wilderness was easing, replaced by a sense of purpose and belonging he'd thought forever lost. From every direction came the soft sounds of water flowing through the new channels, like music in the darkness. Here and there, lanterns bobbed as families checked the water's progress or carried full buckets to their homes. The valley itself seemed to breathe easier, as if finally awakening from a long drought of both water and hope. Near the creek, he passed Mother Barnes and her daughters filling their water barrels. The old woman straightened up, pressing one hand to her back. "Lord provides," she said, nodding to Oliver. "Just got to trust his timing." "Yes'm," he replied, touching the brim of his hat. "Reckon he does." The night air carried the mingled scents of damp earth, water mint, and wood smoke. Oliver paused at the crest of a small rise, looking back across the transformed landscape. Lamplight glowed from dozens of windows, each one representing a family, a story, a future now made more secure by the gift of water. Nalin's lamp still burned in her distant window, a beacon of welcome in the darkness. Oliver felt no need to hurry their growing friendship. Like the springs they'd uncovered, some things were worth waiting for, worth nurturing slowly and carefully until they emerged in their own time. For now it was enough to know that loneliness no longer ruled his days, enough to be part of something larger than himself, to help bring life-giving water to thirsty land, enough to see hope flowing through the valley like the stars fallen to earth, each light a promise of renewal and belonging. The August sun beat down on Main Street as banker Silas Rourke supervised the loading of his personal effects into the waiting stagecoach. His pressed suit looked out of place now among the townspeople going about their business, paying him little mind. Through the bank's windows, clerks could be seen removing his name from the door while the new banker from Denver arranged ledgers on the solid oak desk. Rourke's face tightened as he watched Oliver Boone ride past, nodding curtly without stopping. The mountain man had become a familiar sight in town these days, respected where before he had been merely tolerated. The banker's fingers clenched around his walking stick, knuckles white with suppressed rage. "Last call for the eastbound stage," the driver announced, securing the final trunk. Rourke took one last look at the street where he had once commanded such influence. Now women hurried past without greeting him, and storekeepers turned away rather than tip their hats. His carefully constructed world of influence had crumbled like sand. "Your reputation will recover elsewhere," the railroad surveyor said quietly, approaching from the hotel. "These territories are changing." What worked before? He spread his hands in a gesture of resignation. "And what of your grand plans?" Rourke snapped, bitter to the end. The surveyor smiled faintly. "The railway will still come through, just not where we first intended. The company has agreed to alter the line around the valley's edge. It will cost more, but," he shrugged, "sometimes progress must bend to accommodate justice." As the banker climbed into the coach, a group of Apache children ran past, laughing as they carried water buckets from the new communal well. Their joy seemed to mock everything he had tried to prevent. The stage driver cracked his whip, and the horses lurched forward. Silas Rourke departed Willow Flats much as he had arrived 15 years before, alone, carrying his ambitions in leather cases, leaving little mark on the land he had tried to control. The afternoon lengthened as Oliver and Nalin rode together toward the cavern site. Their horses picked their way carefully along the familiar trail, hooves clicking against stone. The late summer wildflowers nodded in the breeze, painting the hillside in splashes of purple and gold. "Strange to think how it all began here," Oliver said as they dismounted near the cavern entrance. The scorch marks from the fire had faded, but the blackened timbers still stood as silent witnesses to the struggle they had endured. Nalin touched the rough stone wall, her expression thoughtful. "My husband used to say that truth is like water. It finds its way to the surface, no matter how deep it is buried." Oliver removed a simple wooden cross from his saddlebag, crafted from cedar and bound with rawhide. Together they chose a spot near the entrance, where the morning sun would touch it first. As Oliver dug the post hole, Nalin gathered stones to secure its base. "The old ones say this valley has always been a place of meeting," she said, arranging the rocks carefully. "Apache, Spanish, settler, all have left their mark here. Perhaps that is why the papers were hidden beneath your home, waiting for the right time to be found." Oliver paused in his work, wiping sweat from his brow. "Reckon your husband knew something of that. The ledger entries showed he was planning to reveal the grant before—" He let the words trail off, respectful of her loss. Nalin nodded, her eyes distant with memory. "Thomas believed in bridges between peoples. He taught me to read English, encouraged me to keep my mother's healing ways. Some called him a fool for marrying an Apache woman, but he said love knows no boundaries." They worked in comfortable silence, securing the cross and clearing away debris from the entrance. The simple marker seemed to transform the space, turning it from a place of conflict into something like a shrine to reconciliation. As the sun began its descent, they sat together on a fallen log, sharing water from Oliver's canteen. The valley spread below them, green with new life, where the spring-fed channels traced silver patterns across the land. Smoke rose from countless chimneys as families prepared their evening meals. "Your people's songs speak of harmony between the land and those who live upon it," Oliver said quietly. "Took me years in the wilderness to learn what you knew all along, that we're meant to share the earth's gifts, not hoard them." Nalin's hand found his, rough fingers intertwining naturally. The touch was simple but profound, acknowledging the deep current of understanding that had grown between them through the long weeks of struggle. "You have a good heart, Oliver Boone," she said softly. "It sees truth clearly, even when others turn away." The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, setting the scattered clouds ablaze. From somewhere in the valley came the sound of singing, the evening service at the white-painted church, where Preacher Josiah now welcomed all who wished to worship. As they mounted their horses for the ride home, children's voices carried up from the nearest homestead. Young Sarah Jensen's twins spotted them and began waving excitedly. Soon, other children joined them, their high voices calling greetings in English and Apache. Oliver and Nalin rode side by side down the gentle slope, their horses' shadows stretching long before them. More children emerged from the scattered cabins and camps, running alongside their horses for a few yards before falling back, laughing. The valley had changed in ways that went far deeper than the new waterways. Where before there had been suspicion and separation, now the children played together freely. Women shared recipes and garden wisdom across old boundaries. Men who had once eyed each other with distrust now gathered to repair fences and raise barns, sharing food and stories as they worked. Cooking fires winked to life across the landscape as they rode, each one marking a home where water now flowed freely. The evening air carried the mingled scents of cornbread, pine smoke, and sage. From the church came the sound of Amazing Grace, sung in 3 languages, the harmony floating on the cooling breeze. Near the creek crossing, they passed Mother Barnes teaching 2 Apache girls how to card wool, while their mothers washed clothes in the fresh-flowing stream. The old woman looked up and smiled, her weathered face peaceful in the evening light. "Bless you both," she called out. "You've brought more than water to this valley." Oliver touched the brim of his hat, feeling Nolan's quiet pride beside him. They rode on through the gathering dusk, their horses knowing the way home. Neither felt the need to hurry or to define what was growing between them. Like the springs they had uncovered, their connection had emerged naturally, fed by shared purpose and tested by adversity. The first stars were appearing as they reached Nolan's cabin. Oliver dismounted to help her down, their hands lingering together after her feet touched earth. In the distance, coyotes called to one another across the peaceful valley. The sound no longer seemed lonely to Oliver's ears, but rather like a wild celebration of life itself. "Will you come to supper tomorrow?" Nolan asked, her dark eyes reflecting starlight. "The Jensen twins are bringing fresh bread, and Taza has promised to tell stories of the old days." "I'd be honored," Oliver replied simply, understanding that she was offering more than just a meal. She was inviting him to be part of the new community they had helped to build, where ancient wisdom and present hope flowed together like the living waters beneath the land. They stood together in the soft evening air, listening to the mingled sounds of the valley, children's laughter, women calling their families to supper, the distant hymn singing, and always the gentle music of flowing water. All around them, lights bloomed in cabin windows, and cooking fires glowed, each one a beacon of welcome in the gathering night. The harvest moon hung like a copper lantern above the riverbank as townsfolk gathered for the autumn celebration. Lantern light danced across the water, casting golden ripples into the growing dusk. The air carried the rich scents of roasted corn, fresh bread, and pine smoke from the cooking fires. Tables stretched in long lines beneath the cottonwoods, their surfaces laden with earthenware dishes. Women had outdone themselves. Mother Barnes' famous apple pies steamed beside Mrs. Jensen's cornbread, while Nalen's traditional Apache flatbread and honey cakes drew admiring glances. The sound of fiddles tuning mingled with children's laughter. Two Apache boys helped Oliver string paper lanterns between the trees, their small faces glowing with pride as each light blazed to life. Nearby, the schoolmarm directed a group of girls weaving autumn flowers into wreaths. Preacher Josiah stepped forward as the crowd gathered, his familiar voice carrying across the murmur of conversation. "Friends and neighbors," he began, lifting his hands, "we gather tonight to celebrate more than just the harvest. We celebrate mercy that flows like water, justice that grows like wheat, and the gift of sharing God's good earth as true stewards." His prayer acknowledged both settler and Apache traditions, speaking of the Great Spirit's presence in growing things. Oliver stood beside Nalen, aware of how different this gathering felt from the tense confrontations of months past, where once there had been suspicious glances, now he saw settlers nodding respectfully to Nalen, offering her choice portions from their dishes. The music started up properly, fiddles and guitars joining with traditional Apache drums in an unexpected harmony. Oliver watched the firelight play across Nalen's face as she smiled at the sounds. Her dark eyes reflected the lantern glow, and he marveled at how this all began with a simple ant nest near his cabin. "Strange how the Lord works," he said softly. "Who'd have thought those pesky ants would lead to all this?" Land restored, people coming together. He paused, his rough hand finding hers. "Finding you." Nalen's fingers tightened on his as the music swelled. Around them, couples were moving into the fire-lit circle, settlers and Apache alike stepping to the blended rhythms. Children darted between the dancers, their faces bright with joy. "Shall we?" Oliver asked, surprising himself. He hadn't danced since before his first wife's passing, but tonight felt different. Tonight was for new beginnings. Nalen nodded, and they stepped together into the circle. Their movements were hesitant at first, then surer as they found their rhythm. Laughter rose around them like a prayer, carrying up past the lantern light into the star-strewn Colorado sky. In that moment, under heaven's bright gaze, the valley's people moved as one family, their shadows merging in the firelight's dance. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.